thank you so much for inviting me. It's really nice to be with this organization and with all of the advocates and diverse folks in this group. So I am an associate professor of sociology at UCSD. I specialize in immigration from Mexico to the United States, although I'm increasingly working with asylum seekers in Mexico as well. And I also do research on gender and on political advocacy. So what I'm going to talk about today is my scholarly work, my work with immigrant students and community advocacy, and the ways I'm trying to bring these together to sort of enrich immigrant justice here in the border region, because I think these are often siloed fields. And what's going on in Mexico without knowing about migration and migrants from those communities. And so I ended up sort of following people from the communities that I was studying to the US. And it turned out that many of them lived either in Los Angeles or in North County, San Diego, particularly in Vista, California. And I started to learn about the lives of undocumented immigrants in these places. Many of the people that I worked with from Oaxaca had come to the US in the mid-1990s, undocumented, after the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986, to sort of fill the spots of prior undocumented workers in farm work, garment work, domestic work, things like that. What I started to realize very quickly was that even though Los Angeles and San Diego are so close to each other, they were very, very different for undocumented immigrants. Notably, people in Vista and Escondido were facing really arbitrary police abuse, independent of whether they were committing crimes or not. In LA, they were much more likely to be targeted by police for criminal activities, so they had this sort of area of feelings of protection. But in San Diego County, this arbitrary policing made life extremely hostile, especially for women. So whereas many people assume that women from patriarchal countries come to the US and find some sort of liberation, I was finding that in these hostile policing contexts, women actually felt more oppressed. Often they faced even worse domestic abuse. And so some of them actually found a sense of liberation by going back to their home communities. The important takeaway here, I think, is that even though immigration is federal jurisdiction, local level ordinances, policies, advocacy, and police practices mattered a lot for what it felt like to be undocumented. So that's why the book is about place. But from a League of Women Voters vantage point, I think place really refers to what people on the ground in cities and counties are doing to make immigrants' experiences better or worse. So in 2014, I got hired at UCSD and I moved to San Diego. And I immediately started noticing that my students were almost literally the children of people that I had interviewed for my book. Now, they were not the actual children, but in many cases, their parents had come to the US undocumented in the 1990s, many of them from Oaxaca and other similar states. In fact, about 90% of the students I had in class were Latino, most of them women, I think because women are attracted to these kinds of issues. And about half had undocumented parents. And many had parents who had been deported. So I want to just tell you about one of my students, Paulina, who's pictured on the left-hand side here. Paulina's parents came from a rural town in Oaxaca when her eldest brother was young and just before she was born in 1999. She grew up in Los Angeles. Her mom is a nanny. Her dad is a parking lot attendant. And they have a couple of other children as well. Neither of the parents speak English. And when Paulina was a young teen, her brother was deported. Paulina was not like an all-star student in the classroom. She didn't talk that much. She sort of sat in the background. But when I started taking her to Tijuana, she really began to shine. So this is a picture of students in the Casa del Migrante in Tijuana, where I have taken students to do work for the last several years. Of course, it's not happening this year, but I started seeing that she, among others, really began to sort of get out there, laugh, joke with people, get to know them, and really have a lot in common and be able to sort of understand the lives and stories of migrants in a way that I, even being sort of an expert in this area, could not necessarily. So I realized two things. One, students like Paulina desperately needed mentorship and training, right? They have parents who don't speak English and didn't go to high school, but they also had this phenomenal capacity as bridges between two different worlds. One being of college-educated English speaking US citizens, and the other being of their migrant families and Spanish-speaking parents. So I started to realize that I really needed and wanted to work on what was going on right here at the border, to be engaged in community action research, and also to do so in a way that centered students like Paulina and gave them tools to be leaders in immigration rights and immigration work going forward. So how do I do this? A few years ago, I took over a long-standing program called the Mexican Migration Field Research Program. And I started trying to use the work to bring these spheres together. So the program is a year-long program for students in which they enroll in the summer. In the fall, I train them to understand immigration and train them in research methods. And then in the winter, I take them to do high quality research on immigration here in the border region in partnership with local organizations. They have to speak Spanish. And then in the spring, we analyze and write up the results as reports. And in past years, we have actually brought those reports to Sacramento in the State House to try to advocate around policy. So from 2018 to 2020, the last few years, we worked in shelters, particularly the Casa del Migrante, Padre Chava, as well as several other shelters in Tijuana that work with deportees and asylum seekers. We started out trying to speak with deportees and understand the lives of deportees. And then as the caravans began arriving, we just realized we have to start talking to asylum seekers as well. So I want to talk to you a little bit about what we've learned about each of those groups, as well as sort of the research work and that's come out of it and the direction that we're going. So this is a picture actually of my students talking to a group of deported men in the Casa del Migrante. These men have formed an organization of deportees to give each other sort of mutual aid and support and advocate for themselves upon return to Tijuana. This work was so personal for many of my students because often they associated the deportees with their dads or other members of their families. And as we talked to deportees, so we did about 170 interviews in total of deportees, most of them in Tijuana, as well as some later in the summer in Mexico City and Oaxaca. And one of the big things that came out, and I'm actually together with a couple of students writing a book about this now, is sort of the carceral character of deportation. And I know one of you said you're on the criminal justice committee, which I think it's so important for us to get these two areas talking to each other. Because in the old days, deportation was people would be stopped by the police, they would be sent back to Mexico within the span of a day. And then generally most of them would come back to the United States. Today, almost everyone who is deported spends time in detention, and many of them also spend time in prison. So the system of mass incarceration is just fundamentally in bed with the immigration system. Even though most of the people who are being removed from the United States are being removed for driving under the influence, immigration violations, traffic violations, things that most of us wouldn't associate in our heads with major crimes. Um, so we started talking to the men about their lives as members of families, and particularly as fathers. A lot of the men we spoke with were fathers. And I think in the old days, sort of we thought of deportation as really being about geographic separation of families, right? And I think that often a lot of the media discussion of family separation has focused on mothers and children or fathers and children coming into the US. But of course, deportation is separating families every day. And one of the important things that we learned was that this is, of course, about the geographic separation. But what really undermined fathers' ability to be involved with their children and their ability to sort of even imagine themselves as parents and connect to their children who often stayed in the US was time in detention and incarceration and in prison or jail. So the longer people spent in detention or prison or jail, the harder it was for them to connect with their families, the more their sort of sense of self-worth was undermined, the more their relationships with their children's mothers deteriorated. So really the bottom line here is that incarceration combined with deportation, as well as detention combined with deportation, radically increased the barriers to these families operating in any kind of cohesive, loving way, even from afar. And I'm writing a bit more about sort of how incarceration, the combination of incarceration, detention, and deportation affect men, affect their ability to be embedded in society, even in Mexico, and their ability to sort of advocate for themselves. I'd be happy to talk about that a little more if anyone has questions. So the second area, and this is a picture outside of the Padre Chava soup kitchen, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with, that we started working on was asylum seekers. And we began interviewing asylum seekers and talking with them right after the first caravan arrived in November of 2018, or sort of the first major caravan, shall we say. And we began working with asylum seekers in different shelters and trying to understand what kind of strategies or support could be important for them or be enabling, because what's going on with asylum seekers in Tijuana, I think, is paradigmatic of what is going on with asylum seekers around the world, because rich countries like the United States have tried to offshore the reception of asylum seekers to buffer countries like Mexico so that these people never reach US soil, right? And we see this happening right in our own region in Tijuana, where the United States is blocking people from coming in. So people who intended to go to the United States, fleeing gang violence, most of them, end up sort of stuck in this permanent limbo in a country that they didn't necessarily intend to be in. So our work over the past couple of years and our work going forward is trying to understand, under those conditions, which will probably increase with climate crisis, how do you build sort of resilient communities? How do you support people? That kind of thing. And the picture here is from a shelter called Espacio Migrante, which is a new shelter led actually by a young woman who is also a student at UCSD that really emphasizes the arts. And you can tell that by the mural on the wall, as well as the drums and guitar. And students in the shelter did a bunch of research, as well as began to write about the importance of art, music, and creativity for enabling migrants to feel a sense of resilience when they're sort of stuck in this long-term uncertainty. And of course, the MPP program, the Remain in Mexico program, has radically increased that uncertainty, as has COVID and the sort of halting of acceptance of asylum seekers from COVID. So we've tried to expansively think about how those things could be translated into programmatic work to just support migrants overcoming trauma and stuck in this uncertainty. The other thing that's really come up in this work is the information gap among asylum seekers. So the vast majority of asylum seekers have extremely limited understanding of the system of US asylum, or even what asylum is. In many cases, they have fled their countries, not even knowing that asylum exists or having heard of it as a concept, and they hear of it along the way, and they're told that they should apply. But they have no understanding of what gets you asylum or what the criteria for asylum are. So they will apply and then come before a judge, for instance, and say, well, I just really want a better future for my children, which of course immediately undermines the asylum case because they're framing themselves as an economic migrant. So we've started to think a lot about how better understanding what people know and don't know can help us to design get them the right information so that they can make informed decisions in this very difficult context. So how are we doing that this year? We have 3 major projects that we're working on this year, each of which is in close partnership with an organization that is working on advocacy on these issues on the ground. One of those is a new organization called Innovation Law Lab that tries to bring together activists, computer coders, and immigration lawyers to scale up defense of immigrants in detention. And we are working with them to call into detention centers to understand what kind of treatment people are facing and do some advocacy around dehumanization in detention. We're also working with actually 3 organizations in Tijuana who work with asylum seekers. One is Al Otro Lado, which you may have heard of. They are a group of lawyers working with deportees and asylum seekers in Mexico, particularly in Tijuana. Templo Embajadores de Jesus, which is a shelter, and they're trying to build a sanctuary neighborhood. And then Espacio Migrante, whom I mentioned earlier. And what we're trying to do with them is really think about, okay, how do you go from sort of crisis management with asylum seekers to building resilient communities and helping people make informed decisions about what to do in the context of an ongoing sort of deeply exclusionary US asylum system. So we're doing a bunch of phone interviews with asylum seekers working with these groups to map not only sort of what are the greatest needs and how can we help them to get these needs met, but also how do you build resilience in a space of such limbo and uncertainty. And then finally, we're doing some sort of internal work this year at UCSD, because what we found in past years was that students would go to Tijuana, they would see how horribly the US was treating immigrants, and then they would come back to UCSD and say, gee, we see a lot of the same patterns of exclusion within our own university. So we're working on campus at UCSD to really think about how can we break down barriers to the inclusion of Latino students on campus itself. Finally, I want to add that there is a policy dimension to this. This is a picture of some of my students at the California State House. When it's not COVID, we try to take students to the State House to meet with lawmakers. One reason for this is simply to empower students. Several of these students had never gotten on a plane before when we got on a plane to go to Sacramento. And to see them dressed up and actually speaking directly to lawmakers about their own life histories and families, as well as the rigorous empirical research that they had done, is really inspiring. And also we're trying to spread understanding and awareness of the kinds of information that we gather. So I think there's a few takeaways here. Advocates for immigration need quality, systematic research and often just do not have the scope and time to produce that. Scholars are often stuck in the ivory tower, and I'll take some blame for this myself, and aren't getting out on the ground to do research that's applicable to what needs to be done. Latino students need training and mentoring, but they also have this big talent as potential sort of bridges and the next immigration advocates. And I think that policy, as well as local policing and other practices, can benefit from this collaboration. So I just want to end with sort of inviting you to share in dialogue about this. I think that I envision this work, which combines my own research and teaching and advocacy, as something that has to be embedded in community advocacy and in a broader set of people in the San Diego, Tijuana region. And I know that this group has so much experience in that area, in local advocacy and policy work. I think, I'm always looking for others who understand that arena to help me think about how to intervene in that work. We also need help with mentoring. Students always can use mentors who can help them think about careers related to immigration in various kinds of fields. Community and legislative contacts. I know a lot of you guys have those. Help disseminating our findings. We've been very rudimentary so far in just getting the research out there, and then just spreading word to donors. We try to, the students always come away wanting to raise money for the organizations we're working with, but they of course don't have a lot of personal networks who have money, and then fundraising for the program itself. So, I think that's where I'd reach out to you and just say thank you for coming and listening. And I would love to just have this be the beginning of a dialogue about how we can enrich and expand this engaged work in the San Diego, Tijuana area. This is a picture of the students and myself at the State House as well. And I will just add, if you'd like to see more, I have a website for the program, including some of students' reports listed here, mmfrp.org, as well as my personal website and my email address. I'd love to hear from any of you. So with that, I'm going to stop and just invite questions or comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts, ideas, or anything you'd like to share.
Okay, well, thank you so much. This is very valuable. Are you familiar with Ev Mead at USD?
Yes, yeah, I have actually not met him in person, but I know of him.
Okay, so we have done a fair amount of work with him.
Yeah.
Particularly in the past, not in the last couple of years, but
yeah.
He also takes students down to Mexico, and
yeah,
I'm not sure what happens to report on those trips, but he takes them every summer. Okay, are there questions for Abigail?
I actually wanted to bring up, I know you were talking about mentorship.
Yeah.
I myself, my mom immigrated here in the 90s as well. So I come from that background. And when I was looking into a career-wise, I didn't have a mentor. And right now I do research, clinical research, and I noticed that there was a gap as well in the language barrier, where there's like a lot of immigrants who are seeking treatment, and then there's this language barrier. So what I'm actually, I created an organization at UCSD for students to be able to teach Spanish to the UCSD medical students. So in that way, they could have a mentor in med school, seeing if they want that as their career. And then they also teach the medical student Spanish to also break the barrier in the healthcare with Spanish. So I don't know if any of your students might want that opportunity.
Yeah, definitely. I have a lot of students interested in health, some in medicine, some in just health, global health more broadly. I'd love to hear, maybe get in touch with you if you could send me your email in the chat, and I can connect with you about more details, because I would love to share that with students. I think we'd have students really interested. And all my students that I'm working with are bilingual, so they have the Spanish skills. So yeah, it sounds like a cool organization. That's great.
Yeah, I wanted to also, I was talking to RHA, I don't know if you heard, but it's like a free clinic in Tijuana. And we were thinking of also having these students go there because of COVID. Obviously we cut it, but maybe in the near future do that so they can have some sort of experience and, be exposed to immigration and how it is with asylum seekers and the deportees, what they're facing.
Yeah, Cool. We should talk more. I do know a couple of other faculty on campus who bring students to do health-related work in Tijuana. So we should.
Well, there's a whole clinic, right? The med school has a clinic that goes down.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just wanted to say the pharmacy school likewise, for a while, I don't know if they still do, but for a while they did have a class in Spanish so that the pharmacy students could learn Spanish. They also operate and run a free clinic, and there obviously are a lot of Hispanics at the clinic to provide care.
Right.
And you're probably aware of Preuss, which is one of the schools I mentor at, and they're obviously it's nice to start with high school kids so you can really work and guide them. And as obviously people are aware, their parents can't guide them very much for college guidance. So you can work closely with them on giving them suggestions and ideas from applying and all of that. So, and if anybody's interested in mentoring Preuss, I can give you a contact of the woman that gets a hold of people and assigns them to students to mentor them.
Awesome. Thank you.
Okay.
Well, I think it's a wonderful thing that you're doing. And one of the problems is that not everybody, oh, I don't speak Spanish, but I have gone to prisons, and we have a very positive program where you sit in a circle and everybody adopts a very positive name that begins with your first name, because they always go by their last names and number. And we share, and anyway, there have been a lot of transformations. It's called alternatives to violence. So if you're in a conflict, what are some of the things you can use to stop that? And the sad thing is that so many people who have graduated or been released from prison and really have changed and are wonderful human beings have been deported because way back when they were Spanish. But I mean, it's really sad. The other thing is that the same problems of parenting while you're in prison is very upsetting to many people. Yeah. Also, they have to live with the shame and how do you, anyway, there's a lot of rewarding things that you get from that, especially when they're released.
Yeah, and I think sort of connecting some of these programs that actually, think of themselves as different spheres, but are working on similar things is really important. So
the thing is, of course, with the COVID, nobody's going into business.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so in the past, we have gone down to Tijuana and put on parties at some of these shelters for children, but the parents get involved too. And it also allows our volunteers to see what a shelter is like and talk to the asylum seekers. Many of us don't speak Spanish, so that is a problem. But we haven't been able to do that for a couple of years now. So we'll get back into it. And Casa de Migrante, is that the name of it? They won't allow us to come for some reason. We went once, but they didn't want us to come back. We didn't do a party or anything there. We just did a tour and talk to them about what their work was. Yeah,
you can. I could, if you wanted to go back after COVID, it's, I guess, in a year from now when COVID is under control. Yeah, I could help you talk with them. They do like tours and visits. Casa de Migrante itself is largely for men. Historically, it's been entirely for men. Although with the caravans, they did open to families of asylum seekers as well.
Okay. So are there any proposals for Sacramento that you are recommending? Any potential bills or?
In fact, I think this is one of the areas that we need sort of partnership and mentorship, because we haven't sort of gotten to the stage of translating, the research finding into bills. And my understanding is that that's one of the most effective ways to engage with Sacramento, is to have sort of like pre-written proposals for bills. So yeah, we have not this year, particularly because we couldn't go we normally go in May. Last year was COVID. We probably won't go this May either because of COVID. So we haven't gone in a while. But yeah, that's a good question and something that I should think about.
Okay, well, next month, we're going to talk about the bills that are being proposed in Sacramento. So you might want to join us. I'll put you on the email list.
That would be great. Thanks.
Yeah. Okay, Maggie has showed up. Good morning, Maggie. And do you have any questions for Abigail? Or you may not have heard.
I'd love to meet you. I'd love my daughter to meet you. She's going to be starting assistant professorship this summer at UC Santa Cruz in sociology.
Yes, my mother told me about. I looked her up, so her work looks really interesting. I would love to meet her at some point. But, hopefully, we can all connect at some point. That would be great.
Yeah, I guess you guys are going to have in-person classes starting in the fall. That's what they're saying.
That's the hope. Yeah.
So, well, I just apologize. I was helping one of the Haitian Creole speaking women get a lift to get to a really important doctor appointment. And it took 45 minutes to get her to the right corner. And it took 2 Lyft drivers because the first one couldn't find her anyway. So that's what I was doing for the last 45 minutes.
We're doing that.
But I missed everything. I'm just so sorry I missed your presentation.
Well, it's being recorded, so it'll be on the website.
I will look it up and then we'll be in touch. Abigail, thank you so much for your work.
Yeah, sounds great. I've heard great things about you as well. So hopefully we can connect. So if anybody does want to connect with me directly, I will just put my email address into the chat. So you'll have the information right in the chat.
And
Abigail. Excuse me. Can I
go ahead.
Question? Yeah. I just wanted to know if you're working at all with the community colleges. At City, we have a lot of students, of course, who are DACA, many, and we have a lot of students who live on both sides of the border. And so they have a lot of connections because maybe part of the family has been deported and so on. Yeah. And are there any efforts that you know of to build like a bridge from the community colleges for these students who want to continue and get there? I'm in the sociology and in that field because I know there is a humanities program. But
yes, we do have some efforts. So a huge number of students that I work with are transfers from community college, and we do have some efforts, particularly kind of like diversity related efforts to try to get, because the UC system has a path from community college into the University of California system. Right. So I know that our department tries to do recruitment and stuff at community colleges. I will also say that if there are students in local community colleges who want to participate in this program directly without transferring, we have had students participate from other colleges and universities. So that's another option. So if you have students who would either be interested in transferring in, or maybe we could connect actually off the broader group to talk about kind of how to make connections in that regard. That would be really interesting.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you.
Jan, put your email in the chat too, please.
Right, sure.
Thank you. Yeah, Susie.
I had a question, Abigail. Thank you so much for your presentation. Very, very helpful and good. Do you have any sense of what the changes with the new administration might bring? I'm hearing things from some lawyers that I do interpreting with asylum seekers and I'm kind of hearing that.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, my sources of information are similar to yours on this, which is just reading the news and Twitter from experts who I like. But I get the sense that, I mean, if I had to give a quick overview, like what I give to my students, I would say that my hunch is that Biden will largely try to bring us to similar to what was going on with Obama, right? So that's the end goal, but that some of the Trump policies have made real barriers to getting there. For example, Trump has dismantled the refugee resettlement infrastructure. So if you even wanted to admit asylum seekers, you'd have 2 major issues. end MPP and admit asylum seekers and go back to where Obama had things in terms of asylum, you'd have a crisis of sort of overwhelm and a crisis of nowhere to put people. So, and that applies to various components of the immigration system that, Stephen Miller, I don't know if any of you have read Jean Guerrero's book on him, Hate Monger.
Yeah. Yes.
He is. Anyway, so he just put out so many things on immigration so quickly that I think the challenge is how quickly can you change all of that? Similarly, sort of, we've gone all the way backslid on private detention facilities, which are, of course, notoriously much worse than state-run detention. MPP, I think the Remain in Mexico program, dismantling that is going to be very challenging because you have so many people who've been stuck in Mexico forever. You have this massive backlog of asylum seekers. I hope that priorities on deportation will come back very quickly because, of course, Trump has expanded deportation with little regard for whether people have been convicted of crimes. So I hope that Biden will go back to priorities, which he says he will. But I don't know. I wonder, as a sociologist, I wonder about sort of how much people in ICE, for instance, ICE agents have been socialized into arbitrary treatment in this period, things that sort of get embedded in the way systems work that are hard to turn around. So I think that my broad understanding is that Biden will sort of try to roll back some of the Trump stuff, more or less in line with Obama era approaches. I understand that he's also trying to prioritize like investment in Central America to try to sort of address root causes of migration. Personally, I think that will be very challenging because the spread of gangs from the United States to Central America, including through deportation, has just created a phenomenally difficult situation of violence in which the governments of those countries, I think, are have very limited means to deal with the scope of gang involvement and violence, particularly in poor neighborhoods. And those are going to be the same poor neighborhoods hit by climate emergencies, already being hit by climate emergencies, right? We saw the 2 hurricanes this fall. So anyway, I mean, not to be dire about this, but I think, and Biden has not said that much about detention, right? Because I think, as I mentioned kind of earlier in the talk, detention is such a problematic component of the immigration system, and detention, the experience of detention itself, really undermines people's sort of ability to function within society. So I would like to see more action on detention. I think that advocates can do more. This is a state level thing, for instance, can do more advocating against private detention facilities, advocating against indefinite stays in detention, advocating against solitary confinement in detention. One of the problems we face is that, for instance, the Trump administration noticed that there were a lot of pro-immigrant advocates in places like California and Oregon, and has started moving people to Louisiana and Mississippi and so on. So there's been a huge shift in the location of detainees into places where white supremacy is strong and advocacy for immigration is weak. So I think thinking about sort of what folks can do. So actually we're working with a team that's actually calling into detention centers in Louisiana this winter. But those are some of the struggles, right? Is the ways things get relocated out of our eyes and out of the public eye. So yeah, I think that's my hunch with Biden. And I think Biden is going to have to be pushed to move more quickly and aggressively on a lot of the immigration issues. And that some of this can be done at the state level, but some of it can't because they'll just move the immigrants away from us so we can't see it.
Mm.
Well, we've also been talking with members of Congress or their staff each year. We have a problem in that the National League has the position on immigration, and so we can't act on specific bills unless we have their permission, and to get their permission, they have to ask all the leagues in the country, et cetera. So we can't be real specific about bills, but we have talked to members of Congress about concepts.
I mean, I think the benefit of an organization like the League of Women Voters is its national scope and the way, you know, this committee is doing amazing work on the ground in San Diego, but our ability to connect with, for instance, League of Women Voters chapters in places like Louisiana,
Yeah.
where this gets sort of swept under the rug, or immigrants, and particularly Black immigrants. I think some of the worst treatment has been against Afro-descendant immigrants from Cuba, Cameroon, Haiti. So the Black Lives Matter and immigration also overlap a lot. So yeah, thinking about sort of how to build connections that will allow for better advocacy, I think is important as well.
What about all the dialects, Spanish dialects? When I go to court, I'm just amazed that.
Yes, and you know, I would note these are actually completely different languages, right? So many people in Mexico as well as Central America speak indigenous languages, which have nothing to do with Spanish. And many of them don't understand Spanish very well. And my colleague, John Haviland, who's an anthropologist at UCSD, has done a lot of really amazing, he's a polyglot who speaks the many indigenous languages, has done some amazing advocacy and work with court interpreters. So if you wanted to know more about indigenous languages, he would be definitely the person to go to.
What's his name?
John Haviland. I'll put it in the chat.
Beryl, as one of our questions for our state legislators in these legislative interviews we're going to do in the coming month or so, there is going to be an immigration question. So maybe we'll get some more ideas about what's going on at the state level from that.
There's not a state question about it. It's from us, right?
Yeah, it's from us to our state.
I have that on our agenda. We got to work on that. So that's going to be
detention is one of the areas that states can't have some leverage over how it operates and who operates detention facilities. So that's one place that I'd go because states don't have that much control in the asylum system.
Right. But this has to do with SB 54, where the local and state law enforcement is not supposed to share information with ICE and Border Patrol, but some of them are.
Yeah.
So we're trying to get that tightened up.
Yes. So important. Anyway, I don't want to take up too much time, so you all should move on to your next agenda. But I would love to hear from people individually. I did put my email address and my program website into the chat. So if you have ideas or you're working on something related, I think collaboration, connection always make things richer and stronger. So I would love to hear from you. Thanks, everyone. I do have to go, unfortunately, but I would love to, I'm going to keep tabs on all of your work through my mom. She generally updates me weekly on what's going on. So I feel like I have a good inner source. And if you do want to reach out one-on-one, I would love to speak with people.
Well, this has been terrific. We certainly thank you and are very impressed with your work.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for what you're all doing as well.
Okay, thank you.